Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the podcast from New York. I've got Paolo Gaudiano, and he is the author of Measuring Inclusion. It's a winner of a Goody Business Book Award. Today's topic of conversation is going to be all about the backlash against DEI, where we're going, where we're headed, what Paolo sees, and what solutions he's going to offer. I'm really happy to pick his brain and welcome him to the podcast. So, Paolo, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. How are you?
Yeah, we are very informal, so I go by Chris. And talk about you. You name yourself the white guy in DEI. What prompted this, and how did you get started?
Yeah, in fact, when I present my work, I usually joke about being the white elephant in the room. You don't get a lot of people like me in DEI. There are some. I came into it about 10 years ago when I had the ability and the fortune of realizing that the work that I'd been doing prior to that, through a combination of academia, entrepreneurship, was actually something that I thought I could apply to something that until then had been just a personal interest, and namely diversity and inclusion. And so literally 10 years ago, I thought maybe the work that I've been doing, which is really about how do you quantify the link between an individual and whatever collective they're a part of. So I'd done work on consumer insights and how consumers behave in response to what brands are doing. I'd looked at things like personnel management. And then one day I thought maybe I can help to quantify the link between what happens to an individual within an organization as a function of their gender, the race, their sexual orientation, and how in turn what happens to them impacts the success of the company. Because I figured if there is a way to connect those two and to show to a typical leader that they can make more money and be more profitable by making their people happier, then everybody wins in the equation. And so I started doing that 10 years ago. Since then I've created Alaria, which is a small for-profit mission-driven company. I also have a small research center, 501c3, and I've done some work on the academic side, and I run an annual conference.
Interesting. Yeah, you talked about the elephant in the room. One thing is obviously with Trump, he was meritocracy over hiring people less qualified. First thing is everybody thinks, not everybody, but a lot of people that get excluded because of DEI, me, for example, or you, for example, they call it a form of reverse discrimination. And how do you address that?
So I think that a lot of the problem is that the language and the way that it was used, especially after the murder of George Floyd, has been unfortunately creating a miscomprehension about what DEI is supposed to be all about. And in fact, it's ironic to me that people talk about DEI causing reverse discrimination, because the whole idea of DEI was actually to get rid of some of the discrimination that makes it difficult for certain people to get hired or to get promoted just because of their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, etc. Yeah. Unfortunately, what I think is a problem is that people, even though we talk about DEI, people really focus too much on the D alone, just diversity. And so that creates the zero-sum game mindset. If you're going to favor Black people in being hired, it means that you're going to disadvantage white people. If you're going to favor LGBTQ people, it means that you're going to disadvantage heterosexual people. And that's really not quite the right way to do it. But because of the way that a lot of my colleagues in DEI have really promoted that kind of viewpoint and really focused on identity first, it's creating this backlash. Now, the irony is that if you ask people in DEI, they would say that what they really want is what people now call merit, which is that we want to make sure that if somebody's qualified for a job and they have the right qualifications to keep that job and keep advancing, they should be able to do that. And their complaint was, in the past, historically, this has not happened. This has not been the case. And now it's being turned on its head and said, oh, now DEI is a form of reverse discrimination. So I think that a lot of it, unfortunately, has been politicized. I think that there are some very interesting constituencies that are out there that actually believe that it's actually a good thing to discriminate against people, and they're using some of the political maneuvering to make people feel guilty about it. I happen to think that politically right now, it's come to the point where it's ridiculous. Basically, anything bad that happens is blamed on DEI, which I think is a shame. In my work, one of the things that I try to do is that I really try to avoid a lot of these kinds of conversations, because I feel that they can be a dead end and they're so steeped in personal opinions. And what I do in my work is very specifically to say, look, I can show you how the level of inclusion and satisfaction of employees will impact your bottom line. And it will do that in a couple of ways. One of them is that by having groups of people that are less satisfied, they will produce less, which means that they're making less money, and they're more likely to leave, which means that you're going to have to pay money to replace them. And I can literally quantify for any company how much money they're losing by treating different groups in different ways. Now, unfortunately, what's happened in the last few years is that because of the way that DEI has been positioned, and because of some of the backlash, a lot of white men, and not just white men, but other people that come from privileged backgrounds, have actually become less satisfied, which means that in a sense, companies have been shooting themselves in the foot, because thinking that they were helping certain groups of people, they're now actually getting backlash where customers are threatening to boycott, employees are threatening to leave or to sue. And so it's become a big mess. And luckily for me, the book that came out about 6 months ago at this point, on measuring inclusion, shows a very clear path forward. And as a result of that, I'm getting a tremendous amount of interest right now because people hear my talking, they see my TED Talk, or they read my book, and they say, okay, this is a really clear, rational, business-minded way to think about DEI, which does help people from underrepresented groups. But my goal is that it really helps everyone, and it helps companies make more money.
Mm. Yeah. And a corollary, because I want to ask your opinion because I have my own views. A lot of people say DEI help the rich and the poor and the minorities. It's supposed to help the poor and minorities, but it just helped the rich get richer. And then, for example, you look at Asians. Asians are considered minorities, but I haven't benefited from any sort of DEI my entire life. So how do you address this from they called Asians kind of what's it called? The model minority? And
Minority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
I'm going to start by inviting people to think about things in a different way. Okay. I think that the problem that I see a lot that is reflected both in what companies are doing and also in the way that people think about DEI is that it's centered on identity. So you start with the assumption of, oh, Asians, by the way, you're Asian. My wife is from Uzbekistan, which is also an Asian country. You have people from India. You have people from Bangladesh. You have people from many parts of Asia. We have 3 billion people or so that are identified as Asian. And the idea that we can just bucket them all in one place and that they will have the same experiences is ridiculous, right? So my suggestion would be, yes, we can have conversations about the model minority and how it impacts certain people, but we're talking about very broad generalizations that rarely, if ever, actually reflect the experiences of individuals like yourself or like me or like my wife. So what I invite people to think about is that the reason why DEI came about and the reason why diversity, in my opinion, has been a focus is because maybe 60 or so years ago, after civil rights, as more African Americans came into the workforce, and also there was a growing number of women coming to the workforce, those people realized that something was not right. They were not treated well. They were not getting access to promotions, to raises. But the only thing that they could really quantify was looking around and saying, look, there is only 3 of us. There is only 1 of me. And so diversity became the torch that everybody carries. But the problem is to me, that's a symptom. It's an outcome. And focusing on identity first is what creates the problems. And I like to give a very simple analogy. Suppose you walk home one day in the winter and it's really cold. You look at your thermostat and it says 50 degrees. So how do you fix that? You light a match under the thermostat. And now what happens? The thermostat is reading 70, 80, 90 degrees, but meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is wide open, and the roof is leaking. And you might burn your fingers or burn the whole house down. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. The diversity that we see, the buckets of identities that we see are outcomes. They're the result of everything that happens in an organization. In fact, I could argue, and there is a lot of data, that if you look at a company, let's say that has a lower representation of Asian men or maybe of Black women, you will find that the retention rates of those groups are lower than the retention rates of white men, which means that these people are leaving. So we should ask ourselves, why are they leaving? We have a leaky bucket, and instead of pouring more water from the top by insisting that we identify these groups and we hire more of them, we should ask ourselves, what is causing certain groups of people to feel less inclined to stay with an organization? And that's essentially what we do when we measure inclusion. So one way to think about it is stop focusing on identity, but another way to think about it is let's measure what actually matters, what actually impacts people's experiences and behaviors and how that impacts the companies, instead of having disquisitions about whether all Asians are treated the same, whether the model minority is a good idea, and so on and so forth. So again, without getting into the weeds, that's the way that I would really encourage people to think about this in a really different way.
Interesting. We're a business entrepreneurship podcast, and your TED Talk is going to be in the show notes, which is really, I encourage people to check that out. And so talk about what is the business case for DEI. There's so many examples. We had the Secret Service, DEI, and they couldn't protect any. And so what is the business case for DEI?
So first of all, when people talk about the business case, unfortunately, that's another area where I feel that there has been a bit of a misguided attempt to justify the business case. The kind of business case that I've heard used in support of DEI has focused more on overall general trends. For example, studies that show that when you look at 1,000 companies and you measure some aspect of the diversity, typically board level or C-suite level, and then you look at their financial performance, you find that with some indicators in some conditions, companies that are more diverse show higher profits or higher innovation revenues or higher, whatever the case might be. The problem with that approach, which a lot of people in DI think is a convincing case for the business case of a DI, is actually of limited value to a CEO for two reasons. One of them is because a correlation does not imply causality. What do I mean by that? The fact that companies that have higher diversity may have slightly higher performance does not mean that it's the diversity that is causing the performance. One could say very cynically say it's that companies that have more money can afford to buy more diverse personnel, right? And we don't want to believe that, but you can equally lead to arrive at that conclusion. Or it could be that something else is responsible for companies that are both more highly performing and more diverse. And that's actually what I believe. I believe that a more inclusive organization will actually naturally lead to greater inclusion and greater diversity and greater profitability. Now, the problem is that DI has been used on the opposite side to make claims like, oh, the reason why the bridge collapsed in the Baltimore harbor, or the reason why that helicopter crashed into the plane is because of DEI that forced unqualified people to be hired. And one thing that I would urge people to realize is that the very notion that DEI, unfortunately by politicians, has been equated with being unqualified. And we hear a lot of complaints in the data that we measure from people about DEI. We hear two kinds of complaints, mostly privileged white, or let's say white men, or people that come from more privileged backgrounds that complain about the fact that now they're being discriminated against. But we also hear a lot of complaints from people who are not from those backgrounds, Black people, Asians, people with disabilities, who say, because of the approach to DEI, now people are assuming that I'm only here because I'm Black. I'm only here because I have a disability. And it's devastating. I've heard comments from women saying there was a woman that shared an experience in which she said, I was promoted to VP after years of being in this role. And while we're having a celebration, this colleague of mine came up to me and said, the only reason you got promoted is because you don't have anything between your legs. Imagine being told that. So this craziness of DEI being batted around as a political hot potato really needs to stop. And what I try to encourage people to say is, let's stop the rhetoric. Let's stop these extreme viewpoints of, oh, all white men are oppressors, and you all have unconscious biases, and you're horrible human beings, and you're doing terrible things to people on the one hand. And on the other hand, let's stop this craziness of, oh, DI means that you're hiring unqualified individuals. That's absolutely not true. That's absolutely not true. Yes, some companies mistakenly, in trying to implement DI, they created these kinds of approaches that were not very well thought out, in which they really truly did. They didn't know where to find people of color, for example. And so they hired the first people that they found that were not very qualified. Those instances are actually pretty rare, but they get amplified in people's minds. They see one unqualified woman and they assume that all women are unqualified. They see one unqualified Asian man, they assume that all Asian men are unqualified. That needs to stop. And to me, the only way to stop it is a twofold approach. One, show the true business case, which is about how in your company, if you're not being inclusive, how will that impact both the representation of people in your team and how much money you can make? And then secondly, let's stop focusing on diversity and identity as the cause, and let's realize that's a symptom of how well an organization is working, and let's figure out how can we fix that so that we do get greater diversity, not simply by stuffing unqualified people or qualified people into a company, but by ensuring that qualified people can advance through the organization regardless of their identity.
Interesting. And so corollary to that, because the rhetoric is we want to make it a merit-based society, and Europe, Asia, it's all, especially academics, it's just score. If you have this score, you get in. If you don't. But here we have to have these terms like DEI. And the corollary on this kind of meritocracy is DEI in corporations, education. But how come in sports you don't see DEI, and how is the corollary with sports compared to corporate or education?
You're bringing up a couple of issues. I'm going to answer the second one first, and then I come back to the meritocracy. When I hear people say, oh, look, when you look in sports, look, there are a lot of Black people in sports, right? I'm sorry, but that's a very dumb comparison because of the following reason. Maybe on the field, you see a diversity of players, but look at the organization that actually runs the company, that runs the team. And I guarantee you that even if you have, let's say, 12 Black players and 12 white players on a baseball team, I guarantee you that the owners, the leaders, the managers will be primarily white people. So the idea that DEI somehow does not work is just not right, okay? We're using flawed analogies. And one of the things that's very interesting is that relates to sport, that also relates to meritocracy. I've heard a virtually identical analogy used both for and against DI. And the analogy has to do with a foot race. Imagine there is an Olympic race on a track, right? And two versions of this. Version one, the race starts, some of the faster runners are getting ahead, and then the judges say, oh no, that's unfair. We need to have equitable outcomes. Let's slow down the faster racers. Would that be a fair thing to do? Absolutely not. Version two, the race begins. After the first turn, we realized that some obstacles were left on the tracks of only two of the racers, but not the other ones. We didn't see this before. So the racers are stumbling, trying to get over the obstacles, the other ones get ahead. Now, at that point, the question is it fair that the people that got ahead, not because they were faster, but because they had no obstacles, should win? Of course, that's not fair either. Now, here's the problem. Both of those analogies make a profound mistake, which is that they assume that you've watched the entire race. The reality is very different. The reality when we're considering these kinds of ideas is that, look, I go to a race to find out who's the fastest racer so I can hire them to win the next race. But you just walked into the stadium and that some people are ahead of the others, but you don't know why. You don't know if it's because they were faster or because they started earlier or because they had no obstacles. You don't know that. And so the idea that just because we see that one person's resume is better than another person's resume does not mean that they're actually better. Imagine, for example, that if you stayed in the stadium, you would see that the people with the obstacles are actually catching up. Which one is faster? Which one would you rather have in your next race? Would you rather have somebody that was very fast when they had no obstacles, but in reality slower, and that may not be able to race in the future if there are obstacles? So you see, we come up with these analogies and without really thinking about the underlying assumptions. And when we talk about meritocracy, and I've written about this, we all want meritocracy, but here is the problem. Unless those people that say our company is a meritocracy can show me the equations and the formulas that they use to determine what constitutes merit, and they prove to me that they've actually tracked it over 5 or 10 years, and that they've shown that it actually leads to superior financial performance by doing a carefully controlled experiment, then I'm sorry, but a meritocracy is BS. Okay, you cannot call it meritocracy unless you actually prove that you have a quantifiable way of measuring merit and of linking it to the success of your organization. What people in DI want is a meritocracy. They want people who deserve to get a job to be able to get that job. They want people who are performing well in a company to be able to perform. What happens in many companies is that the notion of meritocracy is someone in a leading position or in a decision-making position looks at people and qualitatively says, I think this person deserves to be promoted. And unfortunately, in many cases, that's because I recognize that person's background. They went to the same school, they speak with the same accent, they've gone to the same places. I know that if I succeeded in this place, they will probably succeed too. And when you do that, you enforce homogeneity, and you're not truly doing a meritocracy, but you're simply allowing biases to influence who's in a company. And I would argue that a lot of the biases that we see today and a lot of the lack of diversity is not because people are evil and say, oh, you're Black, I'm not going to promote you. It's simply because sometimes these biases, while individually they can be relatively harmless, when they accumulate over an entire company, they create these systematic and systemic imbalances that we see. So again, I love to take these people come up with these very simple ideas that sound so sexy, they sound so reasonable. But if you look underneath and you ask yourself, what assumptions are being made, you will realize that in many cases, the assumptions are flawed. In some cases, they do that on purpose because they want to try to foster, they want people to be polarized and get mad at each other, which unfortunately is what's happening right now. And in other situations, it's just because we don't think clearly about the implications of what we're suggesting. So
That's a very fascinating discussion. And to end it out, talk about how we can stop the backlash and kind of come together to work together, and also how people can find you and follow you, check out your book, and gain more insight.
Thank you. I think that the solution right now, there needs to be a cooling off period, and it's going to take a while because right now what's happening with the administration is pretty devastating. Unfortunately, that's hurting a lot of people, but I also realize that a lot of the backlash, unfortunately, was created because of misguided attempts to do DI in a certain way. And ultimately, this will pass. And what I expect will happen is that people that are doing really good quality work, where they're actually focusing on measuring outcomes, measuring the impact of initiative, measuring the impact of assumptions about how companies are run, those people will do very well. And my suspicion is that just focusing on creating more inclusive environments for everyone will actually benefit everyone, and will particularly benefit the people that had been the most excluded, without having to call them out and say, oh, I'm doing an initiative for this group or that group. So the way that my company works, and the book Measuring Inclusion describes specifically how we do that. How do we actually measure inclusion? How do we get this additional bit of data? And it's not about, and by the way, we can, in principle, even though every company that we worked with asks us to also use diversity or identity data so that we can say things like this group is more included in that group. The reality is that we can do all of our work without ever making any reference to identity. And we can show how things happen in an organization that hurt everybody, that reduce the potential success of the company through everybody, and how by finding those problems and bucketing problems instead of bucketing people, you can actually achieve much greater success and make your employees happier, which is why the subtitle of my book is Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork and Without Backlash. And so if anybody wants to find me, if you look on any online seller for the book Measuring Inclusion, right now it's the only one with a title. And as you mentioned, hopefully you'll have the link to my TED Talk in the speaker notes, and looking forward to connecting with anybody that's interested in learning more.
Yeah, excellent. Really, I enjoyed this conversation and just looking at different viewpoints and just getting more insight. And so thanks so much, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it. You